Techsauce Global, sparking innovative thoughts. The Near Future Podcast in partnership with Techsauce and SDGX.
And welcome back, everyone, to the Near Future Podcast, brought to you by SDGX and Techsauce. And I am really excited today. You know, at the Near Future Podcast, we're often talking about some of the future technologies and how it has an implication or an impact on society. But often we take an investor's perspective, or we take a startup or a founder's perspective, or something like this. But this is really sort of close to my heart. And today we've got Dr. Markie Twist, who's going to really sort of introduce us to what the reality of some of the technology, how it impacts the family, how it impacts relationships. So let me say hi to Dr. Markie Twist. And Dr. Markie, introduce yourself and let us know what are you doing these days?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, David, on the Near Future Podcast. And thank you, everybody who does remarkable work to make this show possible. It's awesome. I am currently a licensed marriage and family therapist and a licensed mental health counselor. And I do a private practice out of Las Vegas, Nevada. So that is a small part of what I do. I'm also a certified sexuality educator and supervisor. So there's an intersection there with when we consider the role of sexual technology as well as mental health and family relationships. There's a lot that I explore in those areas with people I work with. In addition to that, I'm in the academic world. So I'm the program coordinator of the graduate certificate in sex therapy at the University of Wisconsin-Stout and a full professor in the Human Development and Family Studies department there. And then I've co-authored a couple books related to technology. One was the Couple and Family Technology Framework, Intimate Relationships in a Digital Age, and that came out in 2014. And then a follow-up book, which came out about a year ago, called The Internet, Family, Technology, and Couple and Family Relationships. And those are kind of the big projects I've been doing. In addition to that, most recently, my research and my clinical work has focused on digisexuality and then digi health, like actually looking at what's healthy about our digital relationships and engagement. Because so often people assume addiction or it's not healthy. And we didn't even really have a good definition of what it meant to have a good relationship with technology. So my colleague and I did an informal study of like, how would you define a digitally healthy relationship? So that's the stuff I've been working on recently. And I am excited to have this conversation about the near future and what it'll look like. So I share your excitement.
And this is sort of the crux of the situation at the moment. And because just to go back a little bit, I remember when I was growing up, I grew up in a small village in Canada, a farm village in Canada. And if I couldn't see you, I didn't know you. It was that simple, right? So all the kids around the neighborhood, it was a small village, but all the kids around the neighborhood, that is who I grew up with. That is where I got my influences, my knowledge, my ideas, and started to put things together. But when I look now, I've got 3 daughters. When I look at them now, they've got friends who they would call good friends, but they don't know their real names. They know their handles. They're from countries all around the world. And these are people that they trust and where they're getting their influences and their information from. Now, that has got to be really impactful between generations. And we start to see this happening now. But what is the big difference between, the way I grew up, let's say, and the way that my daughters are growing up right now, and even the future kids, when their whole lives they're going to become virtual and online? Where does that impact? Because clearly you're going to get the argument that this is bad, but it can't be all that bad, right?
Right, exactly. I mean, you can't throw the champagne out with the cork, right? Like, not all of this is bad. And actually, we wouldn't be having this conversation if it wasn't for technology in the modern sense of how we're experiencing it. And it's wonderful to be able to share conversations and knowledge with people all over the world. And I actually had a similar growing up experience to you, David. I grew up in Houston, Alaska, which is a small town. It's a village with 700 people, about the size of Rhode Island. And so the nearest neighbor was like 10 miles away. And there were more moose than people, right? And so I agree with you. I had a very, shall we say, isolated growing up experience, but a very familiar one. Like I knew all the people around me for sure. But that was all that was available. And that's all that's available culturally in that context too. So I think this generation, and I don't know if your daughters are more millennial or Gen Z, but I know for sure the Gen Z generation, or Zoomers, depending on how they'll call themselves after a period of time. But I think their ability to form connections with people both near to them, far to them, known to them, unknown to them, is much greater than any possibility we had in Gen X or the generations before that. And well, we should have caution there, right? Like I'm not saying we shouldn't be mindful and thoughtful. I think what we need to do is actually literally just that. I think we need to consider technology as if it were a member of our family. And if we think of it that way, then we'll have a much more purposeful and intentional dynamic around it. Because as the technology grows and changes, so do the kids, so do the people, so does society. And so it's this dance that we have with each other of growth and change. And the biggest thing we have to do is just give it attention. I mean, you can't pretend like it doesn't exist and everything's okay. You have to have conversations with young people about, hey, you're talking to people in other places and you don't actually know who they are for sure, right? Like you have to at least explore that with them and have caution. But also we don't want that caution to turn into like technophobia or fear of other people or fear of new things, especially when we have to remember this is happening from within the confines of wherever you're at. So you can turn off the technology.
And how does this apply? Let's cut across the generational divide in that sense. Yeah. When you look at the fastest growing group of innovators are those over 50, 55. The fastest group of people getting online is really into that class, the 50, 55 and up class. Now, how does this cut across the generational side? Because young kids, okay, everyone's on their phones. They're getting used to it. They can relate with each other. But for the older generation that are getting online at a much faster rate, and I think that's even more so here in Asia, because the middle class is growing a lot faster here in Asia than it is in Europe and North America. And so they're getting on. So is your research looking at sort of the older people getting on and what that means for their family relationships?
Yeah, it's a wonderful point, and it's definitely happening. Like another way that we see people kind of in the 50, 55, that older population making use of being online, they're still like the number one consumers of Facebook. Like they're the people that are still using that technology as well, that huge social media platform that is in many places, not everywhere, but many places. So older people that I have been working with clinically and then also have been studying in terms of lifespan engagement with technology, what I'm seeing is a couple different things. And I think it's really powerful. One, they're able to connect. They're able to connect with their family at a distance. And that's amazing. And especially during what we just went through in a pandemic, like what an opportunity to get to still have a connection with kids, grandparents, people at a distance. Thank goodness for the technology in that regard and the ability to connect. The other way I am seeing older people make use of technology more recently is their interest in the Digisex, in the sex tech, because that's the main area that I do my work in. And so, I mean, older people are now engaging in a lot more sexting. I mean, they're watching online porn. They're in online porn. They're buying sex toys. They're buying sex dolls. Not as high in the other demographics. It's more people buying them. But we are seeing this. I mean, there is definitely almost like technology is creating, to use technology language, is almost creating like a second life for people in older generations. And it's amazing. Like, I think that's remarkable. So yeah, it's a big change.
Now, when you talk about Digisex, you're talking hardware as opposed to virtual reality?
So that is a great question. So the way that Dr. Neil MacArthur, who's based out of University of Manitoba, and I have defined digisexuality is this way. There's two waves. The first wave of digisexuality was definitely the hardware. It was sex toys, actual like engagement with online porn, like where you actually have to have something that mediates a human technology exchange usually. So it usually involves other humans and then some sort of hardware type technology, something that's tangible. Second wave, however, is where things get much more interesting and where, if we think about the near future, it's where I think we're going. And actually, in many places, already is where we are with some people. So you're looking at like VR sex, augmented reality, sexual experiences. I would still put sex robots here. Even though it's hardware, it's actually in many ways not different than a vibrator. But for whatever reason, the moment that we make it humanoid and also have, more explicit intelligence, people have a different relationship to it. And so then it becomes more second wave technology, because the difference between the first and the second wave digisexuality is the second wave is it doesn't need to involve a human experience at all. It is just the person having a sexual relationship with the technology itself. It doesn't need a human partner. That is not the preferred way of being. And for some people, this really leads to a digisexual identity. They just really, they've decided, or they have an orientation, who knows? We don't know. But they have a connection with the technology itself, not necessarily to humans through the technology.
That's interesting, because I would have assumed that the technology represents somebody, or represents something, but something like this. And you sort of getting your connection. The hardware is doing what the hardware does best.
Yep.
Maybe it has intelligence, so it can actually adapt and learn.
Yep.
But the hardware does what the hardware does best. But what the mind is doing is living within sort of a different sort of fantasy, a different sort of dreamscape that's going on, and that's related with a human. A human a human you don't know, it really doesn't matter, but it's related with a human. And I can see this cutting across, some sense of virtuality where it could be remote control. So there is some person out there controlling the hardware that's having an impact on me. But there's that human connection that's always related. So it's not the machine itself. And that's why I'm actually a bit surprised about that, because I think maybe the next step, as you were alluding to, going into either AR or XR, some sort of a full body experience.
Yep.
And if I can create my world where I meet the people I want to meet in my world and engage and interact with them the way that I want to in my world, what is actually going to stop people from just opting out? And this goes beyond digisexuality. This goes into a life discussion, right?
Absolutely.
If the physical life, this is sort of where the work that I'm doing, but if the physical life is just not acceptable, uncomfortable, and you feel much more comfortable and much more actuated within a virtual environment, why not just simply opt out?
Yeah, I think we see this already. I think we do see people opting out a bit. When you look at people who are heavily immersed in a gaming reality, right? I mean, this is why the World Health Organization, which is not without controversy, why the World Health Organization in 2018 said, hey, there's a gaming disorder. This is something we're worried about, right? Because so many people, particularly many people in Asia, and I know Asia is a broad place, right? There's lots of places within Asia, but we were seeing people, and I'm sure you know this, we were seeing people who were literally opting out of taking breaks to go to the bathroom, taking breaks to eat, taking breaks to drink water, taking breaks to sleep. They were literally so immersed in a gaming reality, or have been so immersed in that reality, that they're opting into it instead of life. And this life, anyway, this tangible life. I'm not going to say that isn't life. It's a different kind of life. But you're right. I mean, there might be people that just 100% have very little interest in whatever this form of reality is, apart from a virtual way of being or an animated or augmented way of being. That could happen. It could. I don't know if it will.
But the transition on that I think we're seeing is that, and I remember the jokes, the gamers sitting in their rooms and they only eat flat food that can fit under the door, these types of things. But then you've got the evolution of esports. So now you have careers, you have an economic opportunity coming out of your ability to be an advanced gamer. And it works into that direction. So it sort of went into that dark area. The dark cloud was there, but that silver lining sort of comes out. And I know parents now that are pushing their kids towards esports. If they're good at gaming, get into the game, get on a team, and see if you can make it a career or something like this. So it's interesting in that.
Or go to college for it. There's scholarships for esports now. I mean, it's a whole different world.
And that's the evolution that's coming out. So when you start to talk about Digisex or having that whole sort of virtual family, not having a real family, a physical family, but a virtual family, and how that's going to evolve, there are some implications, obviously, when it comes into work, when it comes into how do you deal with physical life if you become overly comfortable in a virtual life. And that's so how do you transition between the two, and what is that problem with the transition? Can you take some of the characteristics? And this is the interesting that I find specifically with my daughters or with younger people, that they have characteristics online that they find hard to transition and bring with them offline.
Yep.
And I think this is, so when you talk about sexuality, there's always this concept, true or not true, but there's always this concept of porn addiction, that there is sort of a false sort of understanding of what sex is if you watch too much porn. And then when you start to apply that into a physical relationship, it doesn't quite work. And how do you sort of work the dynamics between that out?
Yeah, that is a great question. So here's kind of my overall thoughts there. There was a lot going on there. So one of the things you mentioned, that young people and your daughters are a good example. I have a child who's 13 and is definitely a digital native. Has grown up with technology. But you're right. There are some ways of being in an online environment that the leap to try to behave in similar ways offline is challenging. And so in the framework that Kat and I developed called the Couple and Family Technology Framework, there's actually different ecological elements. So when I'm working with people around technology-based concerns, whether those are concerns in the tech side of it or the non-tech side in their everyday relationships, when I'm helping people try to manage these realities and ways of being, we explore 8 different areas. And don't worry, there won't be a quiz, but some of them will come up later. So we explore what's acceptable. What about anonymity, right? That's a huge concern people usually have. Accessibility. I mean, right now, the work-life spillover, there's no such thing as a division between work and life anymore. That's high accessibility now. Affordability, which is a huge issue when we get into talking about divides around technology use, right? The affordability is a definite concern. Approximation. And this is the one that I think comes up quite a bit. Like, how much does your virtual or your augmented or your online reality and the way you are, how much does it approximate the way things are offline, right? And that approximation is having sex online the same as having sex offline? I don't know, right? It's approximation. Accommodation is a big one too, where like I might present myself one way online and present myself another way offline, which kind of brings up that idea you had mentioned before we got started today, that idea of cyber identity type issues, like who am I and how does that show up? And then the last two are ambiguity and accountability. And a lot of the questions that we're raising today are about ambiguity. Like we're just not sure about so many things yet. And so that's why even just having conversations is important, even if we don't have all the answers, right? Because if we don't have some clarity around technology, I think this is going to get away from us much faster than we could have anticipated. So like one way we know conversation is different, and this always shocks people, but it might not shock you, is when you have text-based communication. Like let's say you and I start texting, or we start talking through chat, or even back in the day we email each other, right? Like let's say we do that. What happens when you do that is it actually builds intimacy and closeness quicker than if we had talked on a phone, met each other online, or met each other in person. And that's because guess what? I can censor how I am when I type stuff. I can wait to respond. I can be really thoughtful. I can be really witty, right? I can be this almost totally different person through text-based communication. Plus, I'm not interrupting anybody. They're not interrupting me. When I meet in person, however, could be a totally different exchange. And I think that part, even just basic text-based communication and the way it affects relationships, I don't think people really even understand that. And we're not even talking about that. Technology has been around for a very long time now. We're not even talking about like future. We're talking about even past and now, right? And so when we get into what's addictive about technology, what's possibly addictive about watching porn, I think those questions are very hard to answer because we don't even have an idea so far really of what's healthy, what's normal and what's healthy. And so a big area I've been exploring is just what does it mean to be digitally healthy? What does that even mean, right? Because we don't even have a sense of that. So I don't know if that answered it, but definitely I think there are big things on the horizon and things we don't even understand yet about technology in the role of our everyday relationships.
Well, I think that's an understatement. I think I totally agree with that. And I get so many questions coming out. I got to get them into my head here now. But
Right.
but the thing is, and the I think what we're seeing now is we went through a bit of this with the internet, right? So this internet, relatively an unsophisticated technology, a single technology that gets put out there and it has major disruption, social disruption, but also economic and commercial, even political disruption. And a lot of the research is still trying to understand the last 20 years of the internet.
Yep.
And at the same time, we have 5 or 6 clusters of technology, extremely sophisticated technology from AI, flat AI, all the way up to genomics, new material sciences, all these different types of things that are going to come down the pipeline. And it's going to come down faster. It's going to have a much bigger impact because the crossover, AI is interesting, robotics is interesting, but AI and robotics now becomes extremely interesting. And we do have this, and we have these sort of this concept of virtuality coming in. So it is going to happen fast. It's going to happen before we sort of realize it. So I think certainly around virtuality and relationship building or family units have a large impact before that even happens. So there's a lot of things coming out. One question I do want to ask is that the framework that you're working on, is this a tool that a young person can use with their parents so they sort of understand them, or a parent can use to try to understand a younger generation? Is it that type of tool, or is it more a professional tool?
Nope. It's a tool that can be used by everyday people. And it also is helpful in a professional helping sense as well. There's really only the ecological elements, like I already talked about. And actually, there's whole tables available online of questions to ask about each of those elements with kids, with parents, with partners. And the other two parts of the framework are changes to structure. So, like the rules, roles, and boundaries in relationships, and what does technology look like around that, right? Like, that's why you have to keep talking with, if you are a parent, you have to talk with your kids about the rules, the roles, and the boundaries around the technology use. And then if you have a partner, you have to do the same thing because, for example, like, someone can be very comfortable with a partner watching online pornography, maybe watching it with them, which actually leads to more satisfaction. So they can be very comfortable with that. But if it's VR, somehow it becomes more uncomfortable for people, right? Because now it feels too real. Okay, so we're back to approximation. That's that question. And we're like, do we have to renegotiate our rules, roles, and boundaries because of this new technology and our relationship to it? And then the process. Technology also changes the process of relationships or influences it. So, like, how relationships form. I mean, I remember when online dating was viewed as, at best ambiguous and at worst definitely not acceptable. Yep, people saw it as not acceptable unless they were in, like, distance-based situations, or they were like part of the LGBTQ community that's been dating online for like ever, right? And within those groups of people, it was acceptable, but it took, where are we? It took 20 years for everybody else to be like, oh, online dating is a fine way to meet. Yeah, that's totally fine. Right? So technology affects how we form relationships, how we maintain them, and then how they end. I mean, you want to talk about the future, like, people are getting to the point where they can, they can infuse dolls and robots and technology with their ideas, their history, their stories, is that an end? I don't know. But I do think that this framework, I'm sure it's not perfect, but at the same time, it's pretty easy to understand. And we just need to pay attention to technology in a thoughtful way in our relationships, but then also not give it too much attention unless we want that to be our whole thing. And I love that you asked the point earlier where you said, but I never would have thought second wave digisexuality was about the person wanting to have a relationship with the technology itself, the machine itself. I would think it was still more about connection with humans. And I would say that for me, it's like that. But there are definitely people, and maybe they're just making the technology more human than it is. But a really interesting study came out just recently, published in actually the Journal of Religious Studies. And it was out of Japan.
I was going there.
Oh, good. And good. You read it too, because there's hardly nothing, right? And they literally asked people if they'd had sex with their dolls, right? And only 33% had said yes. The majority of the people hadn't done that. But then they asked them if they thought the dolls had, like, souls or had a heart, right? They actually, and that 58% of the people said yes. Yes. Like, that's bigger. That's bigger than just sex. And that's certainly bigger than just the technology itself. Like, that's amazing. Like, these consumers of sex dolls are kind of thinking of these dolls as, humans. They're thinking of them as another being, right? And that's more about attachment than about sex, I think. I mean, and I'm just happy they have someone they can feel connected to, because guess what? There's sometimes people don't have other humans. So that's fine. But interesting.
Well, it's interesting that, and we were discussing this before, but when I had mentioned I'd interviewed Sophia, the robot, and I'd met her designer, her emotional designer. And as we were discussing, we were talking about the behavioral libraries because they're collecting everything. All the data goes into behavioral libraries, and they sort of plug and play their behavioral libraries into Sophia, depending on the situation that she's going to be experiencing. Mm-hmm. And I asked her about religion. I said, is there a moral or ethical library that you're actually feeding into her? And the answer at that time was that they had discussions about it, but they didn't do it for two reasons. One, they didn't quite know how. This was a few years ago. And the other, they didn't know which ethics or morals to actually embed.
Yeah.
Because she was a female designer from California. Sophia comes out of Hong Kong. And I was doing the interview in China. So and how do you feel that all together? And this goes into now as part of the discussion, because I think sex is down the value chain. Relationships is sort of that big question, right? Whether there's a familiar relationship like families, friends, these types of things, or a work relationship or an academic relationship, student, professor. All these relationships, again, the pandemic is a great example because we've sort of accelerated the digital transformation. Everyone's been forced to sort of apply now, either working on Zoom or working remotely or doing all schools online, managing teams online. So the virtuality has really been forced onto a lot of society at the moment. But it drives into that area when it comes into relationships. And we may be able to have that discussion. Two questions coming up. We may be able to have that discussion. But one question would be are you actually working a lot with ethnology or anthropology or these types of people, and how does that sort of fit in? That's one question. The other question is, when we move out of the developed countries, we move out of North America and we move out of Europe and into a country like Myanmar, Cambodia, Indonesia, Malaysia, where there will be a bit of a divide based on wealth and based on, but there's also that cultural divide pushed into it. And quite honestly, all the religions, they're all friends of sex. Whether they want to admit it or not, they're all friends of sex. But how does that sort of cut across that when you get into developing countries? Because I think that the new technology wave is going to have a much bigger impact on developing countries because of the leapfrogging and their ability to jump ahead, as opposed to a lot of the developed countries, North America and Europe, that have so much legacy infrastructure in place that it's going to be very difficult or very costly for them to jump ahead. So those are the two sides, and they're actually connected. Because I think the ethno sort of question is really connected with these other cultures.
I totally agree with that. So first of all, I agree with you in that I think one thing that sex and sexuality does in general with technology is it motivates people to push technology to consumers. So I think that there's been a lot of progress made through the aims of sexuality and the combination of that and tech. So I think I'm grateful for that. I really am. I think that's been amazing. Having said that, I think that technology and our relationship with it is much bigger than that. And I agree with you that we are not only going to see that, and we are seeing it, but we will definitely see that more in developing places. So I mentioned earlier the idea of digital attachment. So this is the idea that you not only have attachment bonds and relationships to other humans through technology, which we know we have attachment bonds, but I actually think that we have attachment bonds to our technology itself. And I think that ability to form a connection to what we might consider an inanimate object, which is not really accurate, but the closest thing we have to it. So for example, one question I ask people around this is like, did you ever have a security blanket or a favorite stuffed animal or anything like that when you were a kid? And most people pretty much everywhere have something at some point that they felt connected to. And I ask them, did you love that? And they're like, yes, of course. And I say, well, did it love you back? And they're like, no, but I mean, and I'm like, right. It doesn't matter. it actually doesn't matter if it loved you back because you felt secure having that object around you. And for some people, it's a place. They feel secure in a place, not necessarily with an object. And then I usually ask people, like, where is that object now? And like half the people can tell me still where their security blanket is from when they were like 3 years old, right? Mm-hmm. Like lots. Then I say, did you ever have a connection to a piece of technology where you feel so much connection to it? Like some people have separation anxiety from their technology. And that's almost the same. So mine was a BlackBerry from like, 2008 or something. And I still have it. I can't get rid of it. I love it. I love how it feels. I miss it. I really do. So like we have attachment. And so here's what I think when it comes to the cultural part and the anthropological ethnography type part. I think, first of all, what we're talking about is both the future, but I kind of feel like, and I'm not a incredibly aged, wise person yet, but I hope to be one day. But as I age, what I really realize is truly nothing is more than just old wine in a new bottle. And so when I think about the connection, particularly in places that don't have the same access to resources yet, I think about how they've had connections to objects before. And when they have connections to their technology, I think it'll be attachment feeling. I think it'll create a sense of feeling close and connected, not only to other people, but through technology and with the technology itself. And if you go back historically and look at Japan, I'm going to keep going back there because there's just tons there, right? Mm-hmm. If you go back, during the Kamakura period, which was roughly like 1180s to like 1300s, and I know it's not exact, but they had mechanical dolls. And those mechanical dolls were used for entertainment and also privately. And they had deep connection to these dolls. Like people thought they had a soul. People thought they had a spirit. And that's a long time ago. That's like 1,000 years ago. This is not necessarily a new thing. I just think that we treat it new because everybody kind of has a bit of technophobia, thanks to the Terminator series. That's kind of what I'm thinking. But I'm not sure we need to be as afraid. I think we can be more excited than afraid. That's my thought. Oh,
I think, honestly, I think when it comes out at a price base and an access base that's easy to get into it, I think it's going to happen really fast. And I think it's to one point. One of the things I think when you're dealing with technology, hardware or software, one of the things that really sort of brings on the connection, I find, is the fact that you can personalize it. You can program it. So whether it's a laptop, whether it's an iPhone, it doesn't really matter. You can actually put your own themes, your own images, this type of stuff, right? Having that ability to, I don't want to say program, but let's say design, or let's say create even. Having the ability to create the relationship, the other side of that relationship, I think that is going to be the big one. And I think my fear is that it's going to become too predictable, right? So having relationships, the fact that you don't know 100% of this person, that unpredictability is what gives it that little edge of excitement, because you're not exactly sure what's going to come out of it. Where if you program it 100%, right? And I think this is where we get into the behavioral libraries, that if you are allowed to experiment with 60% of the behavioral libraries, but 40% are hard-coded or something like that. So so it's a constant experiment. You are always learning something new from your digisexual technology. It's not 100% programmed. And I think that is what's going to make it magic. And honestly, I think it's going to take off. I think it's just, I think it's where humanity is. I think it's where family units are at the moment. And people are looking for escapes. They used to have the travel bug. You could travel to places that no one's ever been before, but that's slowly going away. But now the fact that you can actually create, I don't even know what to call it, spirits, ghosts, ghosted machines, but you can actually create that around you that is physical. So it's not totally virtual. So it's not like Avatar, the movie, or something like that. These are actually physical things around you that you can create and have a relationship with. I think that's It's part of the Holy Grail. It's obviously not the Holy Grail, but it's certainly part of the Holy Grail, wouldn't you think?
Yeah, I absolutely think so. And actually, I had never given much pause to the nature of the fact that there's so much of it will come from that co-creation. The fact that you will create those realities and create your technology and images in the way that you want. I mean, really what we're talking about here on some level goes straight to the idea of almost transhumanism. It's sort of the idea of sort of culture falls away, because what's gender in that environment? What's race? What's culture? What's the gender of a robot? I mean, even, they're so it really brings us to a place of, you're right, it's almost like co-constructed transhumanist realities and identity. Yeah.
Oh, it is. And I think when you get on the point of biohacking, so a lot of biohacking is happening now, but it's very, day one sort of thing that's happening right now. But once you start getting into something a little deeper, or the sort of sexual side of biohacking, I think that is going to be a fascinating area to discover. And I know we're running out of time here. I keep getting reminded.
It was awesome. It was awesome.
But I think this is also an interesting area around the biohacking side too. That it's not, it's man machine. It's not man nor machine. Right. It's sort of man machine, and how those types of relationships can be actually built. So, anyways, we are actually running out of time, and this was a fascinating. I hope we do this again in about 6 months.
Super, that'd be awesome.
I want to get up to speed on this, but let me leave the last statement up to you. When we look at the Asian context, and Japan on one extreme, Japan and Korea on one extreme, you've got sort of India on another extreme, and then you've got sort of Laos, Cambodia, Myanmar. You got this on the other extreme, and these are creating all the divides that are happening within Asia, because it is extremely diversified. But I think what is going to happen in the future is, because of the underregulation, when you look at North America, you look at Europe, they're very overregulated. And this is a problem with Silicon Valley and trying to get new technology out. It's overregulated. The same thing's happening in Paris and Berlin. Asia is basically underregulated. That's why we're seeing such advances in genomics that are happening out here, and advances in some. So my thinking is a lot of this new technology is going to get on the ground first in Asia due to the underregulation happening. So in that context, what do you think? I'll give the last word up to you, but what do you think then when you start talking about the family units, digisexuality, technology as part and piece of relationships, not an add-on, not an influencer of, but actually part of that relationship? What do you think in the near future? What are your predictions?
I think it's a great question. And I think actually I agree with you about the regulations in more Western contexts and how that's sort of stifling more exploration and development. And actually, of like the US and the EU, I would say the UK is actually the most stifled in this way. And I kind of consider them the most technophobic. So I would actually say places like Asia are going to be where not only does it feel like there's more of a history of openness, like I just described about mechanical dolls and other kinds of interactions, I think there's going to be more openness. And given that less regulation, I think it's something that's actually already happening in more of an organic way, that technology is becoming more infused and everydayness, and it doesn't have the same level of like stigma and phobia that it does in maybe Western contexts. And so hopefully we'll have a chance in the West, to learn more. I mean, that would be fantastic to actually like learn more about how that infusion is going and how it works and what maybe is less helpful. There's a lot to learn. And I think we need to be looking more to places like Cambodia and places, I know Japan and Korea are kind of extreme examples, but we definitely need to be looking more to those cultural groups and places on the globe, because the infusion is happening there. It's really not happening here the same way. It's true.
I think that's definite. When you look at the liberalization, specifically here in Thailand, for example, but also the extreme fine lines between culture and subculture in Japan, for example, right? There's that line is so thin between that working man culture, what happens on the street, and that subculture, what happens, at night. That crossover happens rather quickly. Certainly here in Thailand, you see it. So that's why I think these concepts of new sexuality are really going to be not exploited, applied here in a lot quicker way because of the cultural acceptance of that.
Yep.
Fascinating. Okay, then, Dr. Markie Twist, I thank you extremely for coming on board. This is a fascinating subject. It's an underlying subject, I think, that has a lot of impact on other things, economically, politically, socially. I think it has a lot, and it is. It's communication and sexuality. Those are the two biggest issues that people deal with on a day-to-day basis. And I think it's the underpinning, and the more we understand about that, the better we are going to be. Our well-being and health, the better the future of society will be in that. So with that note, thank you, Dr. Markie, and we'll talk to you soon.
Thank you so much.
Techsauce Global, sparking innovative thoughts. The Near Future Podcast in partnership with Techsauce and SDGX.